for your whole life.
But
Does
I know,
that
but
bother you?
we are children of parents that follow us all.
At 89, Joanne Copeland finally spoke the words she had held inside for half a century. Her voice, frail but clear, carried the weight of a life lived in the shadow of a man who made America laugh. Sitting in a quiet Los Angeles living room, surrounded by framed photographs of the past, she looked straight into the camera and said, without bitterness, "He was funny for the world, but not for me." The sentence lingered in the air, a confession and a eulogy at once. For decades, Johnny Carson had been the king of late night, the smiling host who ruled the television screens of millions. He made his guests comfortable, his audience roar, and his producers rich. But at home, when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, there was only silence, long, cutting, and cold. Joanne had lived that silence. She had worn the gowns, attended the banquets, smiled beside him at premieres, and learned how to laugh on cue. But when the doors closed, she faced the stranger behind the grin, a man who used charm as armor and sarcasm as a shield. Johnny didn't need to shout. She once said quietly, "He just stopped talking." It wasn't the kind of heartbreak that tabloids could capture. It was quieter, slower, more poisonous, the erosion of intimacy beneath the weight of fame. Every night, as the audience clapped for Johnny's jokes, Joanne sat alone in a house filled with trophies, waiting for the sound of his key in the door, wondering if laughter was just another way to hide pain. Now, in the twilight of her life, she breaks that silence not to accuse, but to explain, to make sense of the distance that fame had carved between them, to say what she never could when the cameras were rolling. He was America's confidant, the man everyone adored, yet the one person he couldn't speak to was the woman who loved him most. What did she truly witness behind the curtain of his perfection? And why did she choose to stay silent for so long? Before Joanne Copeland ever became the wife who knew too much, she was the woman who believed in the myth of Johnny Carson. In the late 1960 seconds, America adored him. He was the charming host of The Tonight Show, a national ritual that wrapped up every evening with his grin, part mischief, part control. When Johnny stepped on stage, the room came alive. He had that rare magnetism that made even silence funny. He didn't just host a show, he owned midnight itself. To millions, he was flawless, a man who could command a laugh without breaking a sweat. Behind his desk, with a cigarette smoldering in an ashtray and a coffee cup in his hand, he seemed untouchable. Journalists called him the Emperor of Late Night, and advertisers lined up to buy seconds of air beside his name. Women found him mysterious, men envied his ease, and executives feared his moods. It was in that golden storm of applause and power that Joanne met him. She was elegant, intelligent, the kind of woman who carried grace like perfume. She had worked as a stewardess, then as a model, and she had learned how to read people, their hunger, their loneliness, their masks. When she met Johnny, she saw all three. He was magnetic. She would recall, he made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They married in 1963, during the early years of his ascent. To the public, they looked perfect, a television king and his queen. Magazine covers showed them holding hands, laughing at Hollywood galas, sailing off the California coast. There was no hint of the tension that brewed in private. Fame, at first, looked like a crown, but crowns are heavy, and Johnny wore his with suspicion. As The Tonight Show climbed to dominance, the couple's world became smaller. Joanne noticed how Johnny's jokes became sharper, his temper more unpredictable. He could disarm anyone with humor. But the laughter was a weapon too, a way to keep people from getting close. In the studio, he was adored. At home, he was absent, even when sitting beside her. Joanne learned the rituals of his solitude. Before each taping, he would lock himself in his dressing room, pacing, rehearsing lines, sipping whiskey. After the show, there were dinners with network executives, poker games with producers, or simply the drive home in silence. She would ask, "Are you tired?" He would nod, kiss her forehead, and vanish into another room. He didn't argue. He withdrew. He didn't explain. He avoided. And so, silence became the third person in their marriage. Two outsiders. Johnny and Joanne seemed to glide through the decade as one of television's most glamorous couples. Yet, beneath the flashbulbs, the script was already breaking apart. Friends recalled that Joanne often sat quietly at parties, watching her husband charm the crowd. Her smile polite but distant. It wasn't jealousy. One said, it was resignation. Carson's fame came with a cost few could imagine. Every night, millions demanded his best self, and he delivered. But the performance left no room for vulnerability. When he walked off stage, the applause didn't follow, only the echo of it. And he hated that silence, almost as much as he needed it. Joanne once described their home life as a movie set after the director yells, "Cut." Everything looked beautiful, but nothing was alive. The chandelier sparkled. The glasses clinked. The flowers were replaced daily, yet the air was heavy with unspoken things. When reporters asked her about their marriage, she smiled and said all the right lines. "Johnny is a wonderful man. We're very happy. We're both so busy." The public believed it because they wanted to. In the mythology of American television, the king of late night had to have a perfect love story. Anything less would have spoiled the fantasy. But cracks began to show. Rumors of affairs surfaced, not always true, but persistent. There were whispers about his temper, his drinking, his unpredictable moods. Joanne defended him, even when she shouldn't have. He was under pressure. She explained later. He lived in a world that expected him to be flawless. You can't breathe in a world like that. There were nights she waited up until dawn, the television flickering blue in the dark, hoping he'd come home. When he did, the smell of whiskey followed him like a shadow. He would say nothing, drop his jacket, and disappear upstairs. The next morning, he'd crack a joke at breakfast as if the night before had never happened. To the audience, Johnny's gift was making every day feel lighter. To Joanne, that gift became the very wall she couldn't break through. She once said, he could make everyone laugh except himself. There was one moment that haunted her. During a taping, a guest asked Johnny if he ever got lonely. He smiled. The audience laughed, and he quipped, "Not when I am talking." It was a perfect line, quick, sharp, perfectly timed. But Joanne, watching from backstage, felt her stomach drop. She knew what he meant. Talking was his armor, silence was his confession. As the years went on, that silence grew. Joanne tried to bridge it, planning trips, dinners, gentle confrontations. But every attempt dissolved into politeness. "You could never win an argument with Johnny," she said, because he'd turn it into a joke. When she finally asked if he was happy, He looked at her with that familiar TV smile and said, "Of course. Aren't you?" And that was the moment she realized the truth. They weren't a marriage anymore. They were a performance. Two actors reading lines that no longer fit. By the time she left him in 1972, the public was stunned. Who would ever leave Johnny Carson? The tabloids asked. But Joanne knew the answer. The laughter that once brought them together had become the very thing that tore them apart. He had mastered the art of pretending, and she had mastered the art of waiting. Behind the applause, behind the fame, behind the endless nights of television history, there was only one truth. He could talk to everyone but her. And that was the beginning of the end. In the years after she left him, Joanne Copeland often found herself haunted by the sound of applause. It would echo faintly from a television left on in a restaurant or slip through the wall of a neighbor's apartment. Even after the divorce, Johnny Carson remained everywhere on every screen, every magazine, every late-night living room in America. For most people, he was the voice that ended their day with laughter. For Joanne, he was the silence that followed it. She remembered the early days, before the fame turned into armor. Back then, Johnny would call her from the studio, his voice lighter, playful. "Wish me luck. Baby," he'd say. She would watch him later that night, delivering monologues to millions, his timing impeccable. And each time the audience roared, she'd feel a strange blend of pride and loneliness. The man who joked so easily with the world could barely whisper the truth to her. What began as admiration slowly became a quiet ache, a realization that she was married to a man who belonged to everyone but himself. Fame had devoured his intimacy. It gave him validation but stripped him of vulnerability. Joanne saw it happening, piece by piece. He wasn't cruel. She once said, he was just. Unreachable. There were nights when she'd sit on the balcony, listening to the city hum beneath them, waiting for him to come home. The headlights of passing cars flickered like false hopes. When he finally walked through the door, he'd pour himself a drink, loosen his tie, and stare out the window. No words. Just the quiet hum of an air conditioner, the faint tick of a clock, and the distance between them, invisible but suffocating. Sometimes she tried to break through. She'd ask about the show, about his guests, about his dreams. But every question was met with a deflection, a quip, a shrug, a polite smile. He could disarm any confrontation with humor. And she began to realize that laughter was his weapon. It killed intimacy as efficiently as it killed tension. He couldn't talk about pain. Joanne said years later, he could only make it sound clever. In those moments, she stopped seeing Johnny Carson the performer and began seeing Johnny Carson the child, the one who had grown up in the Midwest with a distant father and a mother impossible to please. He had learned early that affection was conditional, that emotions were dangerous, that control was safety. Every joke, every smirk, every perfectly timed pause was part of the fortress he built to keep vulnerability out. Joanne, with her quiet sensitivity, had walked right up to that fortress believing she could open it. But every time she tried, the gate slammed shut. And the more she pushed, the colder the air inside became. One night, after yet another dinner in silence, she asked him if he loved her. He didn't look up from his plate. Of course, he said simply. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, now let's not get sentimental. That was Johnny's greatest fear, sentimentality. Anything that hinted at raw emotion made him retreat. To him, it was weakness. To her, it was life itself. They were speaking two different languages. His was performance, hers was truth. As the marriage deteriorated, Joanne found herself keeping a diary, a quiet act of survival. There is a loneliness that lives in luxury. She wrote once, "You can have a house full of laughter and still feel invisible." There were beautiful moments, too fleeting, fragile, like the flicker of a lighter before it dies. A smile shared in the dark, a gentle squeeze of her hand before a public appearance. The rare night he stayed home and fell asleep beside her without a word. Those were the moments that confused her, that made her believe something still lived beneath the silence. But fame has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward itself, even love, by the end. She wasn't competing with another woman, she was competing with an audience of millions. And no one could win that war. After the divorce, Joanne tried to rebuild a life outside of his shadow. She remarried, became active in charity work, and remained discreet. She never sought revenge, never published a tell-all book, never spoke in anger. Yet, those close to her said she never truly stopped carrying him. Not the man on television, the man she glimpsed only in fragments. In rare interviews, she spoke of him not as a villain, but as a mystery. Johnny was two people, she said. The one the world knew, and the one even he didn't. Her words revealed something deeper than resentment, compassion. She understood that his cruelty wasn't deliberate, it was self-defense. He had been performing for so long that he didn't know how to stop. The applause became oxygen and silence, which once meant peace, began to mean death. That's what destroyed their marriage, not betrayal, not scandal, but fear, the fear of being truly seen. And that fear followed him until the end. Even after Joanne was gone from his life, Johnny continued to collect wives, companions, admirers. Yet every woman who loved him seemed to tell the same story. The charm, the distance, the unspoken sadness behind the laughter. Decades later, when Carson retired from The Tonight Show, millions wept. But those who knew him privately said he was already a ghost, a man who had spent 40 years talking to the world but listening to no one. Joanne watched his final broadcast alone. She said she didn't cry. Instead, she remembered a night long ago when she had asked him what happiness looked like. He had paused, staring at the TV across the room, and said, "It probably has good ratings." In that moment, she realized the truth she could never unlearn. He didn't love fame more than her, he simply didn't know the difference anymore. That was the tragedy she had carried for decades, not the end of a marriage, but the death of a connection that never had a chance to breathe. The world called him a genius. She called him a man afraid of silence. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, she envied him because he could still hide behind laughter, while she was left to live with the echo of it. When Joanne finally spoke, all those years later, she didn't seek pity. She spoke with dignity, with clarity, with something like forgiveness. "I loved him," she said softly. But sometimes love isn't enough when the other person doesn't believe it's real. Her confession wasn't just about Johnny Carson, it was about every person who has ever loved someone untouchable. Every partner who has watched the one they love disappear behind the glow of attention. Every soul who has mistaken applause for affection. For Joanne, the hidden truth was painfully simple. The man who made the world laugh never learned how to make one woman feel heard. The real revelation didn't come in the form of betrayal or confession. It came years later, long after their divorce papers had yellowed, when Joanne discovered what Johnny had done in silence and what he had never managed to say out loud. When Carson died in 2005, America mourned a legend, Obituaries praised his impeccable timing, his grace, his influence on every comedian who followed. The word genius appeared in almost every headline. But what struck Joanne most wasn't what was written, it was what wasn't. No one truly knew who he was when the cameras turned off. And perhaps, she thought, neither did he. A few months after his death, Joanne received a call from an old producer from The Tonight Show. He told her that Johnny had spoken of her often quietly, almost wistfully. He said, "You were the only one who ever understood the cost," the man said. Joanne didn't reply. She just stared out the window, watching the California sun blur through the glass. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves. That was when she realized the truth. He hadn't been cruel. He had been terrified. Terrified of being ordinary. Terrified of being seen. And most of all, terrified of being loved without the applause. The revelation was both heartbreaking and liberating. For decades, she had thought she had failed him, that she wasn't patient enough, warm enough, forgiving enough. But now she saw that his silence wasn't rejection. It was his language, the only way he knew how to exist. He was always performing, she said softly in her final interview, even when he was alone. In one of his old notebooks, found among his belongings, there was a handwritten note in his sharp, almost hesitant script. "The joke is the only truth they let you tell." When Joanne read it, she smiled sadly. That was Johnny using wit as confession, hiding pain inside punchlines. What America thought was comedy had always been code. Every smirk, every pause, every sarcastic jab had been a message disguised as laughter. Don't get too close. Don't let them see you bleed. And yet, buried deep within that armor, there had been tenderness, fragile, brief, real. A friend once recalled Johnny watching an old home video of him and Joanne on a boat. They were laughing, wind in their hair, sunlight bouncing off the water. For a moment, he went silent. Then, quietly, he said, "I didn't deserve her." Joanne never knew about that moment until years later. When she did, it broke her all over again. Not because it was too late, but because it confirmed what she had always suspected. He did love her. But love frightened him more than loneliness. He had built an empire of laughter to protect himself from the unbearable weight of being known. And in doing so, he condemned himself to a kingdom with no warmth, no intimacy, no escape. The biggest shock wasn't the end of their marriage. It was understanding that Johnny Carson, the man everyone thought had everything, never learned how to be happy. Fame, for him, was both medicine and poison. It healed the boy who once felt invisible, then slowly killed the man who needed to be seen for who he truly was. Joanne had witnessed that transformation up close, helpless to stop it. She remembered one of their last conversations before the divorce. He was sitting in the dark, a drink in hand, staring at nothing. She said, "You don't talk to me anymore." He looked up and replied, "If I talk, you'll hear too much." At the time, she took it as cruelty. Now she understood. It was fear. Fear that honesty would dismantle the image he had spent his life building. When she finally walked away, she thought she was leaving a man who didn't care. But in truth, she was leaving a man who didn't know how to care. The revelation, years later, set her free. She stopped wondering what she could have done differently. She stopped carrying his silence like a wound. Instead, she began to see it for what it was, the sound of a man trying and failing to love through the noise of his own legend. In one of her last reflections, Joanne said something that captured the tragedy of their story more than any headline ever could. "He didn't break my heart. He broke his own. I was just there to hear the sound. That was the truth behind the laughter. The king of late night wasn't destroyed by scandal, or by anger, or even by fame itself. He was undone by the silence he chose, the silence that protected his pride but buried his soul. And in the end, the woman who knew too much didn't expose him to the world. She simply forgave him. In the end, Joanne Copeland never sought revenge, nor pity, nor even recognition. What she wanted, after all the years, was understanding the kind that comes when the noise fades and truth is finally allowed to breathe. Her story was not about betrayal or bitterness. It was about the quiet cost of loving someone who could not meet her halfway. When she spoke in her final interview, her voice carried neither anger nor nostalgia. It carried peace, the kind that comes from accepting that some hearts remain closed, no matter how gently you knock. He made people laugh, she said softly. And maybe that was his way of saving himself. Perhaps that is the paradox of Johnny Carson, the man who brought joy to millions but could not find it within himself. His silence was not cruelty, but confession, his distance, a defense. He lived behind a curtain of applause. And when the curtain finally fell, there was no encore, only the echo of laughter fading into the dark. Joanne, too, learned something from that silence. She discovered that love cannot survive without vulnerability. And that fame, when it becomes a substitute for affection, turns the human heart into a performance. What she lived through was more than a marriage, it was a lesson in the limits of illusion. Years later, when asked if she regretted marrying him, she smiled and shook her head. No, she said. Because even in the silence, I learned what love is supposed to sound like. Her words linger like the last note of a song, tender, weary, wise. For every person who has ever loved someone unreachable, her story becomes a mirror. We cannot save those who refuse to be seen. We can only love them until their silence teaches us how to speak for ourselves. And perhaps that is the moral behind the legend. The world applauded him for making it laugh. She remembered him for teaching her the cost of laughter. Maybe the true tragedy was never the marriage that ended, but the loneliness that fame refused to cure. And in that loneliness, both of them became timeless,